are as affected by their actions. However, the happiness of others or humanity as a whole, if viewed as an end, is just as idealistic and almost as paradoxical to common understanding as Plato's concept of happiness. The pursuit of utility, duty, and righteousness can lead to unpleasant consequences. It is also worth noting that in the Gorgias, Socrates explicitly mentions the duty of imparting truth to others. Additionally, the ancient Greeks merged the ethical consideration of others with politics. Both Plato and Aristotle, as well as the Stoics, emphasize the social principle, although in a different form, more prominently than many modern ethical treatises. The idealization of suffering is a concept that has greatly influenced humanity. We need not delve into its theological implications or the errors it may have caused. It is widely accepted that the image of the divine sufferer, whose words were rejected by the world, the man of sorrows spoken of by the Hebrew prophets, has deeply resonated with humanity. Plato seeks to portray a similar image of suffering goodness, with a subtle allusion to the fate of his mentor Socrates. He is convinced that somehow, such a person must find happiness in life or in the afterlife. In the Republic, he attempts to demonstrate that this happiness can be achieved in a well-ordered state. However, in the current state of human affairs, the wise and virtuous are weak and miserable. They are like a person surrounded by wild beasts, exposed to all sorts of injustice and slander. Plato, like other philosophers, is thus led to the conclusion that if the ways of God towards humans are to be justified, the hope of an afterlife must be included. If he were asked whether a person dying in torment is still happy, even if death is merely a long sleep, as he suggests in the Apology, it is difficult to say what his answer would be. There have been a few individuals who, completely independent of rewards, punishments, posthumous reputation, or public opinion, have willingly sacrificed their lives for the good of others. It is hard to determine to what extent an unconscious hope for a future life or a general faith in the triumph of good in the world may have supported these individuals. However, this extreme idealism does not align with Plato's philosophy. He envisions a day of reckoning, where the good are rewarded and the wicked are punished. Although, as he states in the Phaedo, no sensible person will claim that the details of stories about the afterlife are true, he insists that something of the sort is true, and he shapes his life with this unknown future in mind. Even in the Republic, he introduces the idea of an afterlife as an afterthought, once the superior happiness of the just has been established on what is believed to be an unchanging foundation. At the same time, he emphasizes the importance of establishing his main thesis regardless of the distant consequences. Plato's theory of punishment is partly retributive and partly corrective. In the Gorgias, as well as in the Phaedo and Republic, a few notorious criminals, particularly tyrants, are kept as examples. However, most people have not had the opportunity to reach such a level of evil. They are not beyond redemption, and their punishment is intended for their improvement. They must suffer because they have sinned. Like sick individuals, they must seek out a physician to be healed. Critics have argued that Plato's analogy of disease and injustice is only partially accurate and that suffering may not necessarily lead to improvement. The analogy of disease and injustice, or medicine and justice, is indeed flawed, just as the analogy of the arts and virtues. However, ideas must be conveyed through something tangible, and the nature of the mind, which is unseen, can only be represented using figures derived from visible objects. If these figures suggest a new perspective on the mind, we cannot fault them for not perfectly aligning with the ideas they represent. They are limited by the imperfections of language and should not be interpreted too strictly. Plato sometimes reasons from these figures as if they were realities, but that is due to the limited logical analysis of his time. He also fails to differentiate between suffering that leads to improvement and suffering that merely punishes indeeders. He applies a concept of punishment derived from criminal law to the realm of ethics. He does not realize that such punishment is only negative and does not provide a principle for moral growth or development. He comes close to the idea of educating humans, which begins in this world and continues in other stages of existence, as further developed in the Republic. Christian thinkers who have delved into last things have found some enlightenment in his writings. However, Plato does not explain how or in what way punishment contributes to the improvement of mankind. He does not fully explore the principle he affirms in the Republic, that God is the author of evil only with a view to good, and that they were the better for being punished. Nevertheless, his doctrine of a future state of rewards and punishments can be favorably compared to the distortion of Christian doctrine that condemns human beings to eternal damnation based on a brief moment of time or even by chance. He also avoids the difficulty that theologians often face regarding the future destiny of average individuals, such as Thersites, who are neither very good nor very bad, by not deeming them worthy of eternal damnation. We do Plato a disservice by overanalyzing his figures of speech or chains of argument, as well as by asking questions that were beyond the scope of his vision or design. The main purpose of the Gorgias is not to answer questions about the afterlife, but to contrast the true and false life, and to compare human judgments and opinions with judgments based on truth. Plato may be criticized for presenting a superhuman or transcendental virtue in his description of the just man in the Gorgias or in the portrayal of the philosopher in the Theaetetus. At the same time, he may seem to condemn a state of the world that has always existed and will continue to exist among humans. However, such ideals exert a powerful influence on the imagination of mankind. These condemnations are not mere philosophical paradoxes, but rather the natural rebellion of the innate sense of right in humans against the ordinary conditions of human life. Even the greatest statesmen fall far short of the political ideal and are therefore rightly subject to general condemnation. In addition to the main purpose of the dialogue, there are other questions that can be briefly considered. The contrast between good and pleasure, which, as in other dialogues, is believed to lie in the permanent nature of the former compared to the transient and relative nature of the latter. Good and pleasure, knowledge and senses, truth and opinion, essence and generation, virtue and pleasure, the real and the apparent, the infinite and finite, harmony or beauty and discord, dialectic and rhetoric or poetry, are all pairs of opposites that easily blend into one another in Plato's works and are seldom kept completely distinct. It is important to remember that Plato's concept of pleasure is the Heraclitean flux applied to human conduct. It is somewhat unfair to oppose the objective principle of good to the subjective principle of pleasure. The assertion of the permanence of good is based on the assumption of its objective nature. If Plato had focused on the subjective experience of happiness rather than the ideal nature of good, he would have found that happiness is just as transient and precarious as pleasure. The arts and sciences, when pursued without any regard for truth or the betterment of human life, are referred to as flatteries. They are all dependent on the opinions of mankind from which they originate. Plato sees the entire world as immersed in error driven by self-interest. In contrast, there is the one wise man who claims to have found truth and firmly believes that a virtuous life is the only good, whether in this world or the next. Statesmen, sophists, rhetoricians, and poets are all subject to judgment. They are parodies of wise individuals, and their arts are parodies of true arts and sciences. All the knowledge they call science is simply the result of studying the behaviors of the great beast, as described in the Republic. There are several connections between the Gorgias and other dialogues, particularly the Republic, the Philebus, and the Protagoras. The similarities between the Gorgias and the Republic are stronger in terms of both spirit and language, suggesting that they were written around the same time in Plato's life. The Republic provides the education and training that the Gorgias suggests is necessary. Both dialogues share the idea that many weak individuals unite against a few strong individuals in the formation of society, although this is only a partial truth. The sufferings and fate of the just person, the powerlessness of evil, and the reversal of situations in the afterlife are also points of similarity. The poets, like the rhetoricians, are condemned because they only aim for pleasure. In the Republic, they are expelled from the state because they are imitators and cater to the weaker side of human nature. The similarity between poetry and rhetoric can be compared to the idea in the Protagoras that the ancient poets were the sophists of their time. The Protagoras offers more contrast than parallel. The character of Protagoras can be compared to Gorgias, but the concept of happiness differs in the two dialogues. In the Protagoras, happiness is described as deferred or accumulated pleasure, following the old Socratic notion, while in the Gorgias and the Phaedo, pleasure and good are distinctly opposed. This opposition is further explored in the Philebus, where pleasure and wisdom are not considered the greatest good, but they are not completely opposed as in the Gorgias. Innocent pleasures that do not cause pain are allowed to be considered goods. The reference to Gorgias' definition of rhetoric as the art of persuasion, the best of all arts because all things submit to it willingly and not by force, indicates a close and possibly intentional connection between the two dialogues. In both, the ideas of measure, order, and harmony are the links between beauty and goodness. In terms of spirit and character, which includes irony and opposition to public opinion, the Gorgias most closely resembles the Apology, Crito, and parts of the Republic. Similar to the Philebus, albeit from a different perspective, the Gorgias may be seen as relating to Plato's theory of morals, just as the Theaetetus relates to his theory of knowledge. There are a few minor points to summarize. 1. The excessive irony in the reason given for the pilot's modest fee, the proposed use of rhetoric as a means of self-condemnation, and the powerful influence of geometrical equality in both worlds. 2. The connection between the myth and the preceding discussion, such as the fate reserved for incurable criminals like Archelaus, the retaliation of the box on the ears, and the exposure of the souls and judges who were stripped of the clothes and disguises provided by rhetoric and public opinion, similar to Swift's idea that the universe is a suit of clothes. The fiction seems to have led Plato to suppose that the soul retains a corporeal likeness after death. 3. The appeal to the authority of Homer, who said that Odysseus saw Minos in his court, holding a golden scepter, adds credibility to the story. It is important to note that Plato is playing both sides and that critiquing the characters of Gorgias and Polus does not pass judgment on historical individuals, but rather attempts to analyze the characters as conceived by Plato. It is also unnecessary to emphasize that Plato is a dramatic writer and that his real opinions may not always align with those he attributes to Socrates or other speakers who appear to have the stronger argument. Additionally, Plato is a philosopher and a poet, and his work should be interpreted in the context of the history of thought and the opinions of his time, rather than through a modern lens. Some argue that the most characteristic feature of the Gorgias is the assertion of the right to dissent or private judgment. However, this goes against the spirit of Plato and ancient philosophy in general. Plato is not asserting an abstract right or duty of tolerance or the advantages of freedom of thought. In fact, in other parts of his writings, he could be seen as intolerant. The concept of liberty of prophesying had not yet emerged, and Plato is not affirming any abstract right of that nature. Instead, he is asserting the duty and right of the one wise and true person to dissent from the foolishness and falsehood of the majority. At the same time, he acknowledges the natural consequence that someone who speaks the truth to a multitude, regardless of the consequences, will likely suffer the same fate as Socrates. Plato's irony sometimes obscures the idealism to which he aspires. When proclaiming truths that the majority will not accept, he protects himself with an armor that cannot be pierced by them. He takes away their weapons of ridicule and turns the laugh against them. The disguises that Socrates uses are similar to the parables in the New Testament or the oracles of the Delphian god. They partially conceal and partially reveal his meaning. The more serious he is, the more ironic he becomes, and this is particularly evident in the Gorgias. He doesn't bother to seriously address the objections of Gorgias and Polus, which sometimes makes him seem unconcerned with logical requirements. However, in the truest sense, he is always logical and consistent with himself. The form of his argument may be paradoxical, but the substance is an appeal to higher reason. He speaks truths before they can be understood, just as philosophers' words have always been ahead of their time. One source of misunderstanding arises from the wildness of his humor. Callicles and others believe he is joking when he is actually being profoundly serious. Eventually, even Polus becomes serious. In the end, Socrates abandons the argument and disregards the forms of dialectic. He revels in his triumph and retaliates against his adversaries. After this mixture of jest and earnest, we can now return to the ideal truth and present the main theses of the dialogue in a simple form. The first thesis is that it is worse to commit injustice than to suffer it. This is similar to the New Testament's idea that it is better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Socrates' words are more abstract than those of Christ, but they both imply that the only real evil is moral evil. The righteous may suffer or die, but they will be rewarded. Even without a reward, they would be happier than the wicked. The world, represented by Polus, is willing to acknowledge that injustice is dishonorable and punish offenders for their own sake. However, they are not as willing to acknowledge that even if successful, injustice is inherently evil and akin to disease and death. Over time, when great crimes are committed, people are inclined to forgive them because they cannot be undone and have become part of history. This forgiveness is not due to magnanimity or charity, but rather because time has dulled their feelings and forgiveness is convenient. The tangle of good and evil becomes too complicated to unravel, and although people understand that the end does not justify the means, they also recognize that good has often come from evil. But Socrates insists that we should always judge a tyrant the same way. Regardless of his power, fame, or accomplishments, he is and always will be the most miserable of men. The greatest consequences, whether good or evil, cannot change the morality of actions that are inherently right or wrong. This is the standard that Socrates presents. Just because politics and human life are mixed does not mean we should lower our principles to match our actions. The same applies to individuals. The world may occasionally speak of the consequences of their actions, warning that lovers of pleasure will ruin their health and the dishonest will lose their reputation. But Socrates would speak to them not of what will be, but of the present consequence of degrading and lowering the soul. If not tempted by self-interest or passion, all higher natures, and perhaps all people everywhere, would agree with him. They would rather be victims than perpetrators of treachery or tyranny. Reason tells them that death comes to all sooner or later, and it is not as great an evil as living an unworthy life. In fact, to a good person, death is not an evil at all, but the greatest good. Within all of us lie dormant ideals of truth and righteousness that can awaken and bring forth a new life in us at any time. The second thesis is that it is better to suffer for doing wrong than to avoid suffering altogether. There may have been a time when the penalty for wrongdoing was immediate and proportional to the offense. Moral evil would then be indistinguishable from physical evil, and people would avoid vice as they avoid pain or death. However, nature has largely hidden the consequences of our actions from us in order to deepen and expand our characters. We can only foresee these consequences through reflection. Early education aims to cultivate this habit of reflection, which continues in adulthood through observation and experience. The spoiled child is said to be unfortunate later in life because they should have suffered when they were young and been saved from suffering later on. Similarly, a ruler is equally unfortunate if their education and way of life constantly shield them from the consequences of their actions until they experience a terrible downfall, which may not even be their fault. The same principle applies to the impoverished and criminal classes, who rarely reflect on anything other than how to achieve their immediate goals. We pity them and make allowances for them, but we fail to recognize that this principle applies to all human actions. Not being found out in some act of dishonesty or foolishness, from a moral or religious perspective, is the greatest misfortune. The success of our evil actions is evidence that the gods have stopped intervening in our affairs and have left us to our own devices. There is nothing to remind us of our sins, and therefore nothing to correct them. Like our sorrows, they are healed with time. However, corruption continues to spread unnoticed, infecting everything from within. Socrates adds an interesting point to this argument with his customary irony. If you want to punish your enemy, you should let them go unpunished. This is true retaliation. It is similar to the obscure verse in Proverbs, "Therefore if your enemy is hungry, feed him," which is quoted in Romans. People are not in the habit of dwelling on the negative aspects of their own lives. They do not easily see themselves as others see them. They are kind to themselves and blind to their own faults. Self-love always pleads on their behalf. Socrates suggests that they should use rhetoric not to defend themselves, but to accuse themselves. Since they are guided by emotions rather than reason, they must appeal to their feelings. They must speak to themselves, argue with themselves, and use eloquent words to describe the character of their own evil deeds. They must convince themselves to accept any suffering they deserve. This figurative language hides a real thought, which, when expressed differently, applies to all of us. Don't we also accuse and excuse ourselves? We use the rhetoric of prayer and preaching, which our minds silently employ during the struggle between our better and worse selves. Sometimes we are too hard on ourselves because we want to restore the balance that self-love has disrupted. Other times, we hear a comforting voice, like that of a parent. In religious diaries, there is often a sort of drama enacted by people's consciences, accusing or excusing them. Throughout our lives, we constantly talk to ourselves. After all, what is thought but speech? What is feeling but rhetoric? If rhetoric is used only on one side, we will always be in danger of deceiving ourselves. Socrates' words, which initially seemed paradoxical, resonate with all of our experiences. The third thesis is that we do not do what we want, but what we wish. Socrates teaches us a lesson that we are slow to learn. Good intentions and even benevolent actions, when not guided by wisdom, have no value. We often believe something is good for us, only to later discover it is not. The consequences may be inevitable, following an unchanging law, but they often turn out to be the opposite of what we expected. When we increase poverty by giving alms, when we tie up property without considering changing circumstances, when we hastily say things we disapprove of, when we act impulsively in anger and later regret it, when we give others an advantage over us due to a lack of self-control, we are not doing what we want, but what we wish. Actions whose consequences are not carefully considered and foreseen are weak and ineffective. The author of such actions has the least possible power, even though they may seem to have the greatest. They are actually bringing about the opposite of what they intended. Yet, the book of nature is open to them, where anyone who pays attention can learn. Every day offers experiences that reveal our own character and the character of others, but we often ignore them. Contemplating the consequences of actions and our ignorance of them led Socrates to his famous thesis, virtue is knowledge. This is not so much an error or paradox, but a half-truth seen in the early stages of ethical philosophy. It is also the half-truth that is particularly needed in the present age. As the world has grown older, people have been too quick to imagine right and wrong separate from their consequences. On the other hand, a few have tried to reduce morality entirely to its consequences. Socrates, or rather Plato on his behalf, neither divides nor identifies these two elements. The time has not yet come for utilitarian or transcendental systems of moral philosophy, but he recognizes the two elements that form the basis of morality. The fourth thesis is that the goal of life is to be, not to seem. In Plato's time, the Greeks acknowledged that praise was one of the main motivators for moral virtue. For most people, the opinions of others are a guiding principle of action. Therefore, there is an element of appearing better than one is in all things. Almost everyone desires to appear better than they are in order to gain the esteem or admiration of others. A talented person can easily pretend to be pious or virtuous. There is also an unconscious hypocrisy, which according to Socrates is worse than conscious hypocrisy. Additionally, there is the sophistry of social classes and professions. Different ranks of society hold different opinions about themselves and each other. The mind is biased by the study of one particular field of knowledge to the exclusion of others. Stronger still is the prejudice that arises from financial or party interests in certain beliefs. There is the deceit of law, the deceit of medicine, the deceit of politics, the deceit of theology. All of these disguises appear to be the truth. Some of them are very old, and we do not easily free ourselves from them, for we have inherited them, and they have become a part of us. The deceit of an ancient Greek sophist is nothing compared to the deceit of a religious order, or of a church in which falsehood has been accumulating for many ages, and everything has been said on one side, and nothing on the other. The conventions and customs we observe in conversation, and the conflicts of our interests when we have dealings with one another, always obscure our sense of truth and right. The deceit of human nature is far more subtle than the deceit of any one person. Few people speak freely from their own natures, and hardly anyone dares to think for themselves. Most of us unknowingly adopt the opinions of those around us, which we partly help to form. A person who wants to free themselves from these opinions requires great mental strength. They hardly know where to begin in the search for truth. They are met on every side by the world, which is not an idea of theologians, but the most real of all things, being another name for ourselves when considered collectively and influenced by society. Then comes Socrates, who was more impressed than anyone else with the unreality and untruthfulness of popular opinion, and tells humanity that they must be and not just seem. How are they to be? At the very least, they must have the spirit and desire to be. If they are ignorant, they must acknowledge their ignorance to themselves. If they are aware of doing evil, they must learn to do good. If they are weak and lack a sense of self, they must acquire strength and consistency. If they are indifferent, they must begin to take an interest in the important questions that surround them. They must strive to be what they would like to appear in the eyes of their fellow human beings. A single individual cannot easily change public opinion, but they can be true and innocent, simple and independent. They can know what they do and do not know, and though not without effort, they can form their own judgments, at least in common matters. In their most private actions, they can display the same high principles that they show when supported and observed by public opinion. And on some appropriate occasion, on some question of humanity or truth or right, even an ordinary person, because of their natural integrity, may find themselves standing against a whole group of politicians and lawyers and overpowering them. Who is the true statesman and who is the false statesman? The true statesman is the one who brings order out of disorder, who first organizes and then administers the government of their own country, and having created a nation, seeks to reconcile the national interests with those of Europe and humanity. They are not just a theorist or a practitioner of expedients. The whole and the parts come together in their mind. While they conceive, they also execute. Although they must engage with the world, they are not of the world. Their thoughts are not fixed on power or wealth or territorial expansion, but on an ideal state in which all citizens have an equal chance at health and life, and the highest education is accessible to all. And the moral and intellectual qualities of every individual are freely developed, and the concept of the good is the motivating principle for the entire society. The problem they have to solve is not just the attainment of freedom or order alone, but how to unite freedom with order. The statesman who sets these lofty goals for themselves has undertaken a task that will require all their abilities. They must control themselves before they can control others. They must understand humanity before they can manage them. They have no personal preferences or biases. They do not hide personal animosity behind the disguise of moral or political principles. Such pettiness, into which people often unintentionally fall, is overshadowed by their sense of purpose and their love for their country and humanity. They sometimes wonder what the next generation will say about them, not because they are concerned about posthumous fame, but because they know that the overall result of their life will be judged more fairly then. They take their time in executing their plans, not rushing them when the nation is unprepared, but like the ruler of the universe himself, working in the appointed time, for they know that human life, although short in comparison to eternity, is sufficient for the fulfillment of many great purposes. They also know that the work will continue even when they are no longer here, and sometimes, especially when their abilities are declining, they think of that other city whose pattern is in heaven. The false politician is a servant of the state. In order to govern people, they become like them. Their minds are united. They behave like vulgar and tyrannical masters, and the politician becomes their obedient servant. The true politician, if they want to rule people, must make them like themselves. They must educate their party until they cease to be a party. They must instill in them the spirit that will shape their institutions in the future. Politics for them are not a mechanism for pretending to be what they are not, or for carrying out the will of the majority. He himself is a representative figure, representing not the lower, but the higher elements of the nation. He seeks to grasp a better public opinion, as well as a deeper understanding of human affairs, which supports him when the immediate challenges arise. He acknowledges that he cannot forcefully control the world. He can only foresee a few moves on the political chessboard, and can only prepare for a struggle in the coming weeks or months. However, he also understands that there are enduring political principles that contribute to the well-being of states: improved administration, better education, the reconciliation of conflicting interests, and increased security against external threats. These principles are not limited to a specific time or form of government. When the storm comes and challenges arise, he may not know the exact moment of danger, but he is ready to take command and guide the ship to safety. Unlike Plato's captain in the Republic, who was half-blind and deaf, he has a keen eye and a sharp ear. The false politician does not seek the truth, but rather the opinion of the world. He is not concerned with what is right, but what is expedient. He only supports measures that are likely to pass, avoiding any uphill battles. He is unwilling to face persecution and enmity that may result from holding strong political convictions. He starts with popularity and sails smoothly in fair weather, but soon finds himself facing unpopularity. People expect their leaders to be better and wiser than themselves, to guide them in times of danger and save them in times of crisis. They don't want their leaders to blindly follow the ignorant impulses of the popular mind. If leaders fail in a crisis, they are disappointed and cry ingratitude. However, this cry is unjust, as the people, who have not been taught better, have done what could be expected of them, and have treated their statesmen fairly. The true statesman understands that he must adapt to the times and circumstances. He needs allies to fight against the world. He must shape public opinion, and he must unite his followers. Although he is not a mere executor of the majority's will, he must win their support. He is their leader, not their follower, but to lead effectively, he must also follow. He neither exaggerates nor undervalues the power of a statesman, and does not adhere strictly to either the laissez-faire or the paternal government principles. Instead, he seeks to do for the people what the government can do for them, and what they cannot do for themselves due to imperfect education or lack of collective power. He knows that if he does too much for them, they will do nothing, and if he does nothing for them, they will be helpless in certain circumstances. The many cannot exist without the few. While the material force of a country comes from the people, wisdom and experience come from above. Kings and governments have the power to create or cure a significant portion of human problems. The statesman is aware that a great purpose, consistently pursued over many years, will eventually be achieved. The outcome may be influenced by some unexpected events, so he accounts for the unknown element of politics. However, since the game of politics combines chance and skill, if he plays long enough, he is certain to succeed. He may not always be consistent because the world is constantly changing. Although he relies on the support of a party, he remembers that he is the minister for the entire nation. He lives not only for the present, but also for the future, and he is uncertain whether he will be appreciated in his own time or by future generations. He may face opposition from the existing social order and may not be remembered by future generations. There are always discontented idealists in politics who criticize both past and present statesmen, including the greatest figures in history. People have a nagging feeling that they should be better governed than they currently are. Just as the actual philosopher falls short of the ideal wise man, the actual statesman falls short of the ideal as well. This leads to a temperament of dissatisfaction and criticism among those who readily admit their own shortcomings. Whether a statesman makes grand promises or none at all, they eventually face the same level of scrutiny. Sometimes, the more unscrupulous individuals are better esteemed than the more conscientious ones because they haven't disappointed expectations to the same extent. These sentiments may be unfair, but they are widespread, often appearing in reviews, newspapers, and private conversations. Furthermore, the art of government has a tendency to both improve and degenerate as institutions become more popular. Governing for the people is not easily reconciled with governing by the people, as the interests of different classes often overpower the ideas of a statesman who takes a comprehensive view of the whole. According to Socrates, the true governor will face ruin or death and will only be motivated to govern out of fear of being governed by someone worse than themselves. In modern times, although the world has become more peaceful and the dire consequences that Plato predicted no longer threaten English statesmen, anyone who is not driven by blind ambition will only take on a task out of a sense of duty, even if they are likely to fail. And even if they succeed, they will rarely be rewarded with the gratitude of their own generation. Socrates, who is not a politician at all, tells us that he is the only true politician of his time. Let's apply the meaning of his words to the history of our own country. He would have said that Pitt, Fox, Canning, and Sir R. Peel are not the real politicians of their time, but rather Locke, Hume, Adam Smith, Bentham, and Ricardo. These individuals were not well known to the public for most of their lives. They were private individuals. However, they planted seeds in the minds of people that became an unstoppable force in the next generation. One soweth and another reapeth. We can imagine, like Plato, an ideal statesman who perfectly combines practice and speculation, as there is no inherent opposition between them. But experience shows that they are often separated. The typical politician interprets or executes the ideas of others and rarely brings forth new political concepts. Only a few individuals in modern times, like the Italian statesman Cavour, have shaped the world in which they operated. Philosophers are naturally unsuited for political life. Their great ideas are not understood by the masses, and they are disconnected from current issues. Yet, perhaps the lives of thinkers, as they are more peaceful and profound, are also happier than the lives of those in the public eye. They hold the promise of the future, even though they are seen as dreamers and visionaries by their contemporaries. And when they are no longer here, those who would have been ashamed of them during their lives claim kinship with them and are proud to be associated with their names. Now, let's consider the true nature of poetry. Plato banishes poets from his Republic because they are connected to the senses, because they arouse emotions, and because they are far removed from ideal truth. In modern times, we almost mock the idea of poetry having a moral message. The poet and the prophet or preacher were one and the same in ancient times, but in later ages, they seem to have diverged. The art of novel writing, a unique creation of our own in the last century, which, along with the art of reviewing, threatens to dominate all literature, has even less seriousness in its composition. Don't we often criticize novelists for attempting to convey a lesson to their readers? Yet the true role of a poet or fiction writer is not just to entertain or express the feelings of humanity, whether good or bad, or even to deepen our understanding of human nature. There have been poets in modern times, such as Goethe or Wordsworth, who have not forgotten their lofty calling as teachers. The two greatest Greek dramatists achieved sublimity through their ethical character. The noblest truths, expressed in the purest and most beautiful language, are still the proper material of poetry. The poet adorns these truths with beauty and has the power to make them resonate in the hearts and memories of people. The poet not only speaks of themes beyond ordinary life, but also speaks of them in a deeper and more tender way than they are usually felt, in order to awaken those feelings in others. The poet makes the old young again. They give a new dignity to familiar principles. They find noble expressions for moral and political commonplaces. They use sensory things to indicate what is beyond, lifting us from earth to heaven. They express what the better part of us would like to say, and the half-conscious feeling is strengthened by the expression. The poet is their own critic, as the spirit of poetry and criticism are not separate within them. Their mission is not to deceive people, but to reveal their true nature and make them more familiar with the world around them. True poetry is the recollection of youth, of love, the embodiment in words of the happiest and holiest moments of life, the noblest thoughts of humanity, and the greatest achievements of the past. The poet of the future may return to their greater calling as a prophet or teacher. Indeed, we hardly know what can be accomplished for humanity through a better use of the poetic and imaginative faculties. The reconciliation of poetry, as well as religion, with truth may still be possible. Pleasure should not be excluded either. By substituting a higher pleasure for a lower one, we elevate people in the hierarchy of existence. Couldn't the novelist also create an ideal, or rather many ideals, of social life that are better than 1,000 sermons? Plato, like the Puritans, is too afraid of poetic and artistic influences. However, he does recognize the noble purposes to which art can be applied. Modern poetry often becomes a sort of plaything, or, in Plato's words, a flattery, a sophistry, or a sham, in which the poet indulges their fancy and showcases their linguistic and metrical skills without any serious purpose. Such poets seek to please their readers. They have the savoir-faire, or writing technique, but they lack the higher spirit of poetry. He does not understand that true art should bring order out of chaos, prioritize the soul's highest interests, and be pursued for the betterment of society. Instead, he caters to the baser aspects of human nature, glorifying sensual desires and singing about love and the latest trends. Rather than uplifting individuals, he keeps them trapped in the influence of the masses, which a good person has been praying to be freed from. Sometimes, he disregards balance and coherence, expressing what is strongest rather than what is truest. Instead of tackling great and well-executed subjects, he focuses on fanciful ideas that come from an overheated imagination, resulting in strange inconsistencies. He is not in control of his words. Rather, his words, possibly borrowed from other writers, overpower him. While we are not suggesting that we should banish poets, it is hard to believe that their expressions have any positive or life-giving impact on people's minds. Art, politics, and human life must all strive for truth and authenticity, not superficiality or deception. This is what we mean by the greatest improvement of humanity. After considering how we can best use our allotted time, we leave the outcome to God. Plato does not explicitly state that God will arrange everything for the best, but he indirectly suggests that the sufferings of this life will be rectified in another. Since we are currently far from living in the best possible world, Plato, as he does in the Phaedo and Republic, proposes the existence of a purgatory or a place of education for humanity as a whole, and for a select few, a Tartarus or hell. The myth that concludes the dialogue is not a revelation but, like similar descriptions in the Bible or Plato's works, a representation of another life. Visible things cannot reveal the invisible, and Plato is fully aware of this, unlike some interpreters of Scripture. He does not speculate on how one is born again, but he asserts the ultimate triumph of truth and righteousness. He claims that anyone, even the wisest of the Greeks, who asserts otherwise is simply ridiculous. There is also an ethical paradox in which pleasure and pain are considered indifferent, and virtue, at the moment of action and without considering consequences, is happiness. Plato seems to shy away from this elevation or exaggeration of feeling, leaving it to the Stoics of a later generation to argue that a philosopher can be happy even when impaled or tortured. It is worth noting that in the Republic, Plato raises this question but does not thoroughly discuss it. The ideal state and the prospect of another life overshadow it. The martyr or sufferer who sacrifices themselves for what is right or true is often believed to die in ecstasy, with their eyes fixed on a heavenly city. But even if there were no afterlife, could they not still find happiness in performing an action that only led to a painful death? They might be grateful to God for allowing them to serve, without expecting a reward. The joys of another life might not have been on their mind at all. Do we believe that medieval saints like Saint Bernard, Saint Francis, or Saint Catherine of Siena, or the Catholic priest who recently dedicated himself to death by a lingering illness to comfort and assist others, were thinking of the pleasures of heaven? No, the work itself was already heaven to them, and it was enough. Similarly, the dying patriot would not be dreaming of the praise or fame that comes with immortality. A sense of duty, righteousness, and trust in God would be sufficient for them in that moment. Even if they were certain that there was no afterlife, they would not have acted or spoken differently in the pursuit of truth or humanity. However, they would not believe that God had abandoned them or that the future held nothing for them. The greatest act of faith, the only faith that endures, is the belief of someone who has not seen but still believes. Only a few individuals throughout history, including Christ himself, have achieved such a noble understanding of God and the human soul. However, we can still hold their ideals in our minds, remember their examples, and allow their lives to shed light on the mysteries of philosophy and theology. Plato's myths are a unique phenomenon in literature. There are 4 longer myths found in the Phaedrus, Phaedo, Gorgias, and Republic. The most elaborate and complete myth among Plato's works is found in the Republic. 3 of these major myths, specifically those found in the Phaedo, the Gorgias, and the Republic, discuss the fate of human souls in the afterlife. The Phaedrus contains a magnificent myth about the immortality, or rather the eternity, of the soul, which includes both past and future states of existence. In addition to these, there are several other myths or fables in Plato's works. The Statesman presents a myth contrasting a life of innocence with the ordinary life of humans and their awareness of evil. The legend of the island of Atlantis, a fragmentary imaginary history, is mentioned in the Timaeus and continued in the Critias. The Laws introduces the story of the foundation of a Cretan colony, although it quickly becomes less significant. The dialogue named after Protagoras includes the beautiful yet somewhat artificial tale of Prometheus and Epimetheus, narrated in a rhetorical manner. The Phaedrus also includes the parody of the orator Lysias in its opening speech, as well as the competing speech of Socrates and his subsequent retraction. Additionally, there are the tales of the grasshoppers and of Thamus and Thuoth in the Phaedrus. Other notable myths include the parable of the cave in the Republic, which summarizes the previous argument and represents the nature and levels of knowledge through a visual depiction. The fiction of the earthborn men in the Republic and Laws, which adapts an old tradition to create a new beginning for Plato's ideal society. The myth of Aristophanes regarding the division of the sexes. The parable of the noble captain, the pilot, and the mutinous sailors in the Republic, which represents the relationship between the philosopher and the masses of politicians. The ironic tale of the pilot who charges a small fee for saving lives because he is uncertain whether it is better for them to live or die in the Gorgias. The treatment of freemen, citizens, and slaves by physicians and their apprentices in the Laws, which serves as a metaphor illustrating how laws communicate with different individuals. Plato also employs continuous images throughout his works. These include the imagery of bees, both stinging and stingless, representing paupers and thieves, in the 8th book of the Republic. The sun, which symbolizes the idea of good in the intellectual realm, is compared to the visible world in the 6th book of the Republic. The composite animal, with a human form but containing a lion and a many-headed monster beneath its human skin, appears in the Republic. The great beast represents the populace, while the wild beast within us represents our passions that are prone to erupt. Plato also uses animated comparisons, such as the dishonored maiden and the parricide, to depict the degradation of philosophy by the arts and the nature of a tyrant, respectively. The dog is presented as the only true philosopher. The image of the argument wandering without a head, veiling her face, engaging in a chase, and breaking upon us in waves are repeated throughout Plato's works. It is worth noting that nearly all of these parables and continuous images are found in the Republic, with the exception of the midwifery of Socrates and the Theaetetus. Additionally, the mathematical figure of the number of the state, or the numerical interval that separates a king from a tyrant, should not be forgotten. The myth in the Gorgias is one of those descriptions of the afterlife that, like Virgil's 6th Aeneid, appears to draw from mysteries. It presents a vision of rewards and punishments awaiting good and bad individuals after death. The body is believed to continue existing in another world, reflecting its condition in this world. The myth includes a paradiso, purgatorio, and inferno, similar to the myths in the Phaedo and the Republic. The inferno is reserved for only the greatest criminals. However, the dialogue frequently refers to the argument and its meaning, which somewhat undermines the vividness and coherence of the narrative. The structure of the fiction is quite simple, with the main moral point being that in the judgments of the afterlife, there is no possibility of hiding or concealing one's true self. Zeus has taken away the ability to foresee death from humans, and souls, along with their judges, are brought together naked and undisguised at the judgment seat. Both parties are exposed, stripped of any veils or clothing that could hinder them from seeing or being seen by each other. The myth in the Phaedo follows a similar pattern but has a more cosmological and poetic nature. Plato presents the imaginative idea that the upper atmosphere is a combination of earth and heaven, a glorified earth that is fairer and purer than our own. Just as fish live in the ocean, humans live in a lower sphere, occasionally lifting their heads to catch a glimpse of the world beyond. The earth we inhabit is like a sediment of coarser particles that have fallen from the heavenly earth, comparable to the desert and the shores of the ocean in relation to us. The myth also includes descriptions of the interior of the earth, allowing for the introduction of various mythological names and places of torment for the wicked. There is no clear distinction between the soul and the body. The spirits in the underworld are referred to as souls, but they still have a shadowy form when they cry for mercy by the lake. Only philosophers are said to have rid themselves of their bodies. In Plato's myths about the underworld, there is a place for repentant sinners, as well as separate places for the very good and the very bad. Plato suggests that most people fall between these extremes, so there must be a place for them too. In the myth of the Phaedo, the repentant sinners are taken down the river Acheron to the Acherusian lake. There, they dwell and are purified of their evil deeds, while also receiving rewards for their good deeds. There are also incurable sinners who are cast into Tartarus and suffer eternally for their heinous crimes. Another group of sinners, who are only slightly curable, are allowed to approach the shores of the Acherusian lake from time to time. They cry for mercy from their victims, and if they obtain it, they come out of the lake and are relieved of their torments. None of these myths, nor any other allegory or parable about the unseen world, is consistent within itself. The language of philosophy mixes with mythology, abstract ideas become personified, and figures of speech become realities. These myths can be compared to Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, where theological discussions are intertwined with travel incidents and mythological figures interact with humans. They are also adorned with names and phrases from Homer and other Greek traditions. The myth of the Republic is more subtle and consistent than the other two. It has a greater sense of realism and is full of details that resemble human experiences. It is worth noting that the 12 days that heirs spend in a trance after being killed coincide with the time that spirits spend on their pilgrimage. It is an interesting observation, not often made, that good people who have lived in well-governed cities are more likely to make mistakes in their life choices compared to those who have more worldly experience and exposure to evil. It is also a common tendency to blame others when we should really blame ourselves. The philosopher must reluctantly acknowledge that chance plays a role in human life that is sometimes beyond our control. The idea that people drink more from the waters of forgetfulness than is good for them is a poetic way of describing a familiar truth. Many of us have known individuals who, like Odysseus, have grown weary of ambition and only desire rest. It would be interesting to know what happens to the infants who die shortly after birth, but Plato only raises this question without providing an answer. The two groups of souls, ascending and descending at the chasms of heaven and earth, conversing when they reach the meadow, and the majestic judges sitting in heaven, are features of the great allegory that have an indescribable grandeur and power. As previously mentioned, the inconsistency found in the other two myths can also be seen in this one. It serves as both a model of the heavens and a representation of the Day of Judgment. These three myths are unlike anything else in Plato's works. They have an Oriental, or rather Egyptian, element to them and bear resemblance to the mysteries and Orphic modes of worship. They are somewhat un-Greek, as there are few similar examples in other serious Greek writings. In spirit, they are more medieval. They are akin to what can be considered an underground religion found in various ages and countries. They are presented in a vivid and graphic manner, but Plato never asserts their truth. Instead, he claims that nothing better can be said about the afterlife. He seems to use these myths when he has reached the limits of human knowledge or when he stands on the outskirts of the intellectual world. They are simple in style, with a few details that bring the picture to life in our minds. They also carry a certain authority due to their use of sacred and familiar names, similar to how fragments of scripture have a power of their own when applied to any subject. These myths serve as a substitute for poetry and mythology while also reforming them. Their moral can be summed up in a few words. After death comes judgment, and there is a better fate awaiting the good than the evil. Literature often incorporates elements from the past. For example, the story of the earthborn men in the Republic may seem like a far-fetched idea, but it becomes more appropriate when we remember that it is based on a legendary belief. The art of making stories about ghosts and apparitions believable is said to lie in the way they are told. The effect is achieved through various literary and conversational techniques, such as raising curiosity beforehand, mentioning small details, simplicity, vividness, the naturalness of the situation, and so on. Plato possesses a unique level of skill in this art that has never been matched. The myth in the Phaedrus is even more impressive than the myths that have been previously described, but it has a different nature. It explores a past life rather than a future one. It portrays the conflict between reason, aided by passion or righteous anger, on one side, and the animalistic desires and instincts on the other. The soul of a person has followed a god and has seen the truth in its universal form before being born into this world. Our current life is the result of the struggle that took place then. This world is connected to a previous world, just as it is often projected into a future one. We ask the question, where were people before birth? Just as we also wonder, what will become of them after death? The first question is unfamiliar to us and therefore seems unnatural, but if we look at the entire human race, it has been as influential and widespread as the other question. In the Phaedrus, it is actually a figure of speech that represents the spiritual battle of this life. The grandeur and power of the entire passage, especially the beginning part known as the theme or proem, the mind through all her being is immortal, can only be inadequately translated into another language. The myth in the statesman relates to a previous cycle of existence in which humans were born from the earth and, due to the reversal of the earth's motion, had their lives reversed and were restored to youth and beauty. The dead came back to life, the old became middle-aged, and the middle-aged became young. The youth became a child, the child became an infant, and the infant disappeared into the earth. The connection between the reversal of the earth's motion and the reversal of human life is merely verbal, but Plato, like theologians in other eras, argues from the consistency of the story to its truth. The new order of the world was directly under the rule of God. It was a state of innocence in which humans had no needs or worries, and the earth naturally produced everything. God was to humans what humans are to animals. There were no large estates, families, private possessions, or any traditions from the past because all humans were born from the earth. This is what Plato refers to as the reign of Kronos. In a similar manner, he connects the reversal of the earth's motion with a legend that he himself probably invented. The question then arises, under which of these two cycles of existence were humans happier? Under the reign of Kronos, which was a state of innocence, or under the reign of Zeus, which is our ordinary life? Plato momentarily balances the two sides of this serious debate that he has presented in a figurative manner. The answer depends on another question. How did the children of Kronos spend their time? They had unlimited leisure and the ability to converse not only with each other but also with animals. Did they use these advantages for philosophy, gaining knowledge, fr?